At Thanksgiving, my children disowned me. They sat across the table, the air thick with the smell of turkey and cranberry sauce, and my daughter's voice broke the silence like a knife. "We've decided, Mom, it's best if you're no longer part of this family." The words didn't come with tears or hesitation, but with a cold, calculated finality. My son sat beside her, nodding, his jaw tight, his eyes refusing to meet mine. In that moment, the people I had given my life to, the very children I had raised, sacrificed for, and poured my heart into, erased me. And what did I do? I laughed. Not because it was funny, not because I felt strong, but because sometimes laughter is the only sound that can cover up a heartbreaking in real time. I reached into my bag, pulled out an envelope, and slid it across the table. "Here," I said softly. "This is for all of you." Their eyes flickered with confusion, suspicion, even a hint of greed. But when they opened it and saw what I had done, their faces went pale. Their comfortable lives, the ones built partly on my sacrifices, were about to collapse. Before I continue, if you've ever felt the sting of being unappreciated by your own family, if you've ever given everything only to be treated as disposable, then I know this story will strike a chord. Please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing how far these stories reach, and your support helps keep them alive. The story I'm about to tell isn't just about betrayal. It's about love taken for granted, about the painful moment when a mother realizes her children see her not as a person but as a bank account, and the courage it takes to reclaim dignity. It's about secrets, consequences, and the quiet power of a woman who refuses to be erased. My name is Dorothy, I'm 64 years old, and for most of my life I believed that family was unbreakable. I grew up in a time when respect for parents wasn't optional, it was the backbone of our households. I carried that belief into my own motherhood, pouring myself into Brian, my only son, and later welcoming his wife Chelsea into our lives as if she were my own daughter. For years, I gave everything I had, financially and emotionally, to make sure they never lacked what I once lacked growing up. When they wanted to buy their first home, it was me who sold my own small 3-bedroom house and handed over nearly every penny from the sale. I told myself it was love. I told myself I was building security for my son's future. I moved into their new place, tucking myself into the guest room, telling myself I was lucky just to be near them, to watch their family grow. But as time passed, the warmth turned to chill. I started to notice the way Chelsea looked at me, like I was clutter in her perfect new house. I heard the sighs, the whispered conversations late at night, the complaints about how I was always there. And Brian, my own flesh and blood, didn't defend me. Instead, his silence cut deeper than any words could. It was as though the woman who had carried him, who had stayed awake during his fevers, who had given him every opportunity, no longer existed. Still, I told myself not to complain. Mothers don't give love to get it back. We give because it's who we are. But there's a difference between giving love freely and being treated like a burden. Over time, the dinners grew colder, the conversations shorter, the respect thinner. I was still cooking meals, folding laundry, watching over their children, but I had become invisible in my own home. The breaking point came on Thanksgiving. The table was set, the candles flickered, the food was steaming hot, but the warmth I longed for wasn't there. Instead, Chelsea rose from her seat, smoothed her dress, and with a voice as sharp as glass, announced that they had made a decision. I was no longer part of the family. It wasn't about space or disagreements. It was about erasure. She wanted me gone, and Brian's silence confirmed he agreed. I looked at my son in that moment, searching for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of the boy I once knew, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. I realized then that the home I had sacrificed for was never truly mine. I was a guest, and now I was being evicted from the very life I had built for them. But here's the thing about mothers like me, we may look fragile, we may sound soft, but we are not powerless. I had been preparing for this day long before they spoke the words. And the envelope I slid across the table wasn't just paper, it was the weight of choices, the cost of betrayal, the kind of consequence that can't be undone with an apology. When they opened it and realized what I had done, the silence in the room was louder than any scream. Their faces drained of color, their eyes darted back and forth, and for the first time in a long time, they understood something they had forgotten. A mother may give endlessly, but she is not to be underestimated. This is the story of how my children disowned me, and how, in the end, I was the one who forced them to face the life they had built without me. I didn't decide on revenge overnight. It wasn't a rash impulse or a moment of anger. No, it grew slowly, like a splinter buried under skin, becoming impossible to ignore with time. Every sigh Chelsea gave when I entered the room, every time Brian avoided my gaze instead of defending me, every whispered conversation that stopped as soon as I walked into the kitchen, all of it told me the truth long before they had the courage to speak it aloud. I may have been quiet, but I wasn't blind. I could see that in their eyes. I wasn't Dorothy the mother anymore. I was Dorothy the wallet, Dorothy the babysitter, Dorothy the inconvenience. And when a person begins to notice the shift from being loved to being tolerated, something changes inside of them. I started preparing long before Thanksgiving, though I never let them know. On the outside, I continued folding their laundry, watching the children, pretending to be grateful for the scraps of attention they threw my way. On the inside, I was building a safety net of my own, something they never imagined I had the strength to do. You see, when I sold my little house and gave them the money, I didn't hand over everything. It was close, yes, but not all. I had tucked away a portion, small at first, but enough to grow over the years with careful planning. Quietly, without their knowledge, I built accounts in my own name. I saved. I invested. I thought ahead. It wasn't because I expected betrayal, but because something deep inside me, perhaps the part of me that had been disappointed too many times before, knew I couldn't rely on anyone forever. The truth is, I knew Chelsea didn't like me from the very beginning. The day Brian brought her home, there was a look in her eyes, a flicker I couldn't quite name at the time. It wasn't hostility, not outright. It was more subtle, like she was measuring me, calculating how much space I would take up in her life, and deciding she didn't want to share. But I loved Brian, and I wanted him happy, so I ignored it. I told myself I was being paranoid. Mothers often do. But years of quiet slights add up. The way she took credit for meals I cooked. The way she told the children, "Grandma is just helping for now," as if I were temporary. The way she complained to her friends on the phone, not realizing I could hear, about how exhausting it was to have me under her roof. I bit my tongue more times than I can count, swallowing my pride because I thought that was what mothers were supposed to do. And Brian. Oh, my son. He had once been so tender, so protective. He used to tell me I was his world. But marriage changed him. Or maybe it revealed a part of him I had refused to see. Slowly, he became someone I didn't recognize. He laughed at jokes about in-laws, even when they were pointed at me. He let Chelsea make decisions that erased me, and he stayed silent when she pushed me to the margins. Silence can be the loudest form of betrayal, and his was deafening. So I prepared. I gathered paperwork. I consulted quietly with a lawyer, someone who spoke to me with respect, who reminded me that what I had given was not obligation but choice. And choices, he said, can be redirected. He helped me make adjustments that no one in that house knew about, changes to my will, to the accounts, to the property titles. On paper, I seemed as vulnerable as they believed. In reality, I was holding on to the one thing they didn't expect me to have, control. I never intended to use it against them. For a long time, I told myself it was simply protection, a backup plan if things ever became unbearable. I even felt guilty, as though keeping something for myself was selfish. That's what being a mother does to you. It teaches you to put yourself last until the thought of survival feels like a betrayal. But as the months wore on, the guilt faded, replaced by something stronger, clarity. The breaking point wasn't even Thanksgiving. It was a Tuesday night, months earlier. I had made a pot roast, slow-cooked all day, and when I brought it to the table, Chelsea didn't even look up from her phone. She pushed the dish aside and said, "We'll order something." This isn't what I wanted. Brian said nothing. Not thank you, not she worked hard, not even acknowledgement. That night, as I scraped uneaten food into the trash, I realized I was invisible. It was then that the plan stopped being theoretical. I promised myself that when the day came, and I knew it would, I wouldn't leave quietly. I wouldn't let them throw me away like an old coat. I would remind them of who I was, what I had done, and the power they had mistaken for weakness. So by the time Thanksgiving arrived, my mind was already made up. The envelope in my bag wasn't an act of desperation. It was a statement, years in the making. It wasn't just about money or property or legal documents. It was about dignity. About refusing to let the people you love most write you out of your own life story. When Chelsea announced that I was no longer part of the family, I felt the sting, yes. My heart cracked in ways only a mother can understand. But beneath the ache was something steadier, the calm of a woman who had been waiting for this exact moment. The laughter that escaped me wasn't madness. It was the sound of recognition, of a plan finally unfolding. And when I placed that envelope on the table, I didn't do it to punish them. I did it to show them that I had never been as powerless as they believed. That even love, when trampled on, can transform into something sharper. That sometimes, the quietest people carry the heaviest weapons. The room went silent when I placed the envelope on the table. My hand trembled slightly, but not from fear. It was the kind of trembling that comes from years of holding in too much, years of biting your tongue until it bleeds. I slid the envelope across the polished wood, and it stopped right in front of Chelsea. For a moment, no one moved. The turkey sat untouched, the candles flickered, and the children looked up in confusion, sensing the tension but not understanding it. Chelsea narrowed her eyes at me, a smirk tugging at her lips as though she thought this was another display of my pathetic need for attention. She picked up the envelope with a sigh, muttering, "What now?" When she tore it open, her expression shifted almost instantly. Her confident posture faltered as she pulled out the papers, her eyes scanning line after line, her face draining of color with every word. Brian leaned over to see, confusion knitting his brow, until his own eyes widened in disbelief. It was all there, in black and white, the documents I had been preparing for years. Updated wills, property transfers, account records, proof that the security they had assumed was theirs had never truly belonged to them. Proof that the house they lived in, the comforts they enjoyed, were not guaranteed. That all the stability they had built their arrogance on was, in fact, conditional. Chelsea's hand shook as she read aloud, her voice sharp and disbelieving. You left everything to Charity?" Her words echoed through the room, slicing the air. The children froze, forks suspended midair, their young eyes darting between their parents and me, sensing a storm but not yet knowing its force. Brian grabbed the papers from her hand, flipping through them in a panic. His lips moved as he read, his breath quickening, until finally he looked up at me with eyes I hadn't seen since he was a boy, wide, fearful, searching for reassurance. "Mom, what is this? This can't be real." But it was real. Every line carried the weight of my decision, the silent hours spent at the lawyer's office, the careful signatures that marked the moment I chose to stop being invisible. I didn't need to raise my voice. My calm silence was louder than any shouting match. Chelsea, however, erupted. "This is a joke. It has to be." After everything we've done for you, she stopped herself, perhaps realizing the absurdity of her claim. After everything they had done for me? The words rang hollow, almost laughable. I met her glare steadily, my voice even. "It's not a joke. It's my choice. I gave you more than I ever had to. And still, it was never enough. So I decided to give what I had left to people who might actually appreciate it." Her face twisted, a mix of rage and fear. "You can't just cut us out. We're your family." Family. The word hung in the air, heavy and bitter. I thought of all the nights I had spent comforting her children, all the meals cooked, the bills paid, the quiet sacrifices that had gone unnoticed. If family meant using someone until they were empty, then perhaps I had already been cut out long before she spoke the words. Brian slammed the papers down on the table, his voice cracking with desperation. Mom, please, you don't mean this. We're sorry, okay? We didn't mean to. His words trailed off, hollow, insincere, the apology of a man who only realized love's value when its benefits were slipping away. I looked at him, my son, the boy I had once carried in my arms, the boy who used to hold my hand so tightly in crowded places. For a brief moment, my heart ached, the instinct to forgive flickering like an old flame. But then I remembered the silence. The countless times he let Chelsea's words cut me without defense. The look in his eyes when he chose comfort over loyalty. No, Brian, I said softly, though my voice carried the weight of years. You made your decision long before I made mine. Tonight, you just found out the cost. The room grew unbearably still. Even the children seemed to sense that something irreversible had happened. One of them whispered, "Daddy," but received no answer. Chelsea's lips pressed into a thin line, fury blazing in her eyes, though beneath it was something far more raw, fear. The kind of fear that comes when the ground beneath you suddenly gives way. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a strange calm settle over me. For the first time in years, I wasn't the powerless one in the room. I wasn't the burden. I wasn't the shadow. I was the one holding the pen, the one who had written the ending they never saw coming. Chelsea shoved the papers back at me, her voice sharp and trembling. You'll regret this. You'll die alone, and no one will care. Her words should have hurt. They might have, once. But not anymore. Because I finally understood that loneliness isn't being alone in a house. Loneliness is sitting at a table surrounded by people who wish you weren't there. And I was done mistaking proximity for love. Brian lowered his head, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. He didn't say another word. Perhaps he knew there was nothing left to say. I reached for my glass of water, my hand steady now, and took a slow sip. Maybe I will die alone, I said quietly. But I'll die knowing I chose dignity over desperation. That's something none of you can take from me. And with that, I stood, leaving the papers where they lay, a silent verdict written in ink, unchangeable. The next morning, the house felt strangely quiet, as if the air itself had absorbed the echoes of last night's confrontation. I sat at the kitchen table with my tea, the sunlight slipping through the lace curtains and pale ribbons. My hands wrapped around the cup, the warmth grounding me as I let the silence stretch. There were no footsteps rushing down the hallway, no laughter, no clatter of dishes being put away. It was as though the house itself had decided to grieve. Chelsea and Brian didn't come down for breakfast. Not that I expected them to. Pride has a way of keeping people behind closed doors, convincing them that silence is better than facing the truth. I could almost hear their whispers upstairs, hushed, urgent, tinged with panic. No doubt they were scrambling to figure out how to undo what they had just discovered. Perhaps Brian was pleading with Chelsea to apologize. Perhaps Chelsea was already plotting ways to challenge the documents, to twist my choices into something she could control. But what struck me most wasn't anger. It was the heaviness of sorrow. A sorrow that came from knowing my children, the very people I had carried inside me, raised, and sacrificed for, were more concerned with losing comfort than losing me. That their first reaction wasn't regret for the cruel words they had said, but fear of losing what they thought belonged to them. Later that afternoon, I overheard their children arguing. Chelsea's daughter, barely 12, whispered fiercely to her cousin, "Why did Mom say Grandma isn't family?" "She is." The boy, Brian's eldest, looked away, shoulders slumped. "Dad says it's complicated," he muttered, though the confusion in his voice betrayed him. I felt a pang deep in my chest. They shouldn't have to carry the weight of their parents' selfishness. And yet, even in their innocence, they could see the cracks their elders refused to acknowledge. That night, Chelsea finally appeared in the kitchen. She didn't meet my eyes. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, her face pale but still hardened. "I talked to Mark," she said flatly, referring to my lawyer. "He said there's nothing we can do." Not unless we prove you were coerced or incompetent. Her eyes darted to mine then, sharp, searching, almost hoping to find weakness. So, tell me, Mom, do you even know what you're doing? Her words stung, not because of the accusation, but because of the implication that my choices had no value unless she approved of them. I set my teacup down carefully, steadying my breath before answering. I know exactly what I'm doing, Chelsea. For once in my life, I'm not making decisions out of fear. I'm making them out of clarity. Her lips pressed into a thin line. You'll regret this, she said again, echoing the threat from the night before. But her voice lacked its earlier venom. It sounded thinner now, frayed at the edges. Brian was softer when he finally came to me the next day. He lingered in the doorway, his eyes heavy, his posture slouched like a boy caught in trouble. Mom, he began, his voice low, Chelsea's upset. She doesn't mean everything she says. He broke off, rubbing the back of his neck. We thought we'd always have you to lean on. Maybe we took that for granted. For a moment, I saw the boy he used to be, the one who clung to my skirt when he was scared, the one who asked endless questions about the stars and the meaning of forever. But the man before me was someone else, someone shaped by years of convenience, someone who had learned to stay quiet when speaking up was too hard. I wanted to forgive him. My heart ached with the pull of it. But forgiveness is not the same as forgetting, and I couldn't erase the way he had sat silent while Chelsea told me I was no longer family. Brian, I said softly, you didn't just take me for granted. You let her words define how you saw me. And by staying silent, you chose her over me. His eyes filled with shame, his shoulders caving under the weight of my words. He didn't argue, didn't deny it. Instead, he nodded slowly, the truth finally settling in. The following days passed in strained quiet. Chelsea busied herself with phone calls, desperate attempts to find loopholes or allies who might pressure me into changing my mind. Brian avoided confrontation, burying himself in chores that didn't need doing. And the children, caught in the crossfire, tiptoed around the house, their laughter subdued, their eyes too wide for their age. At night, when I was alone in my room, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with the ache inside me. A part of me longed for the family I had once imagined, the kind that gathers not just out of obligation, but out of love. A family where words like burden or cutout never enter the conversation. But that family was a dream, and dreams, when clung to too tightly, can suffocate. So I let go. Not of my children entirely, but of the illusion that they would ever love me the way I loved them. I let go of the desperate hope that if I gave enough, they would finally see me. And in that letting go, I found a strange peace. One evening, I sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The air was cool, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a quiet strength inside me. I wasn't waiting for someone to come sit beside me. I wasn't yearning for their approval. I was simply there, breathing, alive, whole in a way I hadn't been for years. Because family, I realized, isn't always the people you share blood with. Sometimes it's the people who choose to stand with you, who see you not for what you provide, but for who you are. And while my children might never understand that, I did. And that understanding was enough to carry me forward. Word travels fast in small towns, faster than you'd think. By the end of the week, whispers had already made their way through church pews and grocery store aisles. People knew something had happened at our Thanksgiving dinner. They didn't know the details, but they sensed the shift. At church that Sunday, I noticed the curious glances. Some were soft, tinged with sympathy, others were sharp, like questions waiting to be asked. I sat alone in the pew, hands folded neatly in my lap, focusing on the stained glass rather than the murmurs. When the service ended, Margaret, a longtime neighbor, approached me with hesitant steps. I heard there was some trouble with the kids, she said gently, as though afraid her words might break me. Her eyes searched mine, not for gossip, but for truth. I considered brushing it off, giving her a polite smile and moving along. But something inside me shifted. I was tired of hiding, tired of pretending everything was fine. They told me I wasn't family anymore, I said simply. The weight of the sentence hung in the air. Margaret's eyes widened, her hand flying to her chest. "Oh, Dorothy," she whispered, her voice thick with disbelief. "I'm so sorry." No mother deserves to hear that. The truth spread quietly after that. Not in a malicious way, but in the soft ripple of shared sorrow. Friends dropped by with casseroles, with warm embraces, with words that filled the silence my children had left behind. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. Chelsea, however, didn't take kindly to the town's subtle shift in attitude. I overheard her one afternoon on the phone, her voice sharp and defensive. "She's making me look like the villain." That's not what happened. People don't understand the whole story. But the truth was, people understood more than she realized. They had seen me attend every school play, every fundraiser, every community drive. They had watched me hold this family together while my children reaped the benefits. They knew, even if Chelsea refused to admit it, that my worth didn't disappear because she wished it so. Brian kept quieter. He still carried himself with that slumped posture, the weight of shame pressing down. Once, as he walked past me in the hall, he paused. "Mom," he murmured, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to fix this." My chest tightened at his words. "Maybe it's not about fixing," I told him softly. "Maybe it's about facing it." He didn't reply, but the way his eyes shimmered told me he understood more than he let on. Meanwhile, my grandchildren grew restless. They began seeking me out in secret, slipping into my room with their books, their questions, their quiet need for comfort. Chelsea's daughter, Emma, whispered one evening, "Grandma, Mom said things she didn't mean. Don't leave us, please." I hugged her tightly, the innocence of her plea breaking something inside me. "I'm not leaving you, sweetheart," I assured her. Even when people say hurtful things, love doesn't just disappear. It was then that I realized the bond with the younger generation was still intact. They hadn't been hardened yet by bitterness or greed. They still knew love when they felt it. And if I could hold on to that, maybe there was hope. One afternoon, I received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was unfamiliar, shaky, but deliberate. It was from a woman named Lorraine, a widow from the other side of town. She had heard what happened, and her words were like a balm. They said the same thing to me once. "My son told me I was nothing without my checkbook. I thought I was the only one. Thank you for showing me I'm not alone." I sat at the table, the letter trembling in my hands. Tears blurred the ink, but I let them fall. Because for once, my pain had reached someone else, had given them courage in their own loneliness. And that was when it dawned on me, maybe this was bigger than just my family. Maybe the injustice I had endured was part of a much wider wound, one that other mothers, other fathers, carried in silence. And if my story could break that silence, then perhaps it was worth the heartbreak. The next Sunday, when Margaret suggested I share my experience at the women's group, I hesitated. My instinct was to retreat, to guard my wounds fiercely. But I remembered Lorraine's letter, remembered Emma's small arms around my waist, and I found myself nodding. When I stood before that circle of women, my voice trembled at first. But as I spoke, about the Thanksgiving dinner, about the envelope, about the cruel words that sliced deeper than any knife, something shifted. Heads nodded, tears were wiped, hands reached across to clasp mine. Stories poured out in return, tales of neglect, of children who had forgotten the sacrifices of their parents, of loneliness masked by forced smiles. In that circle, I wasn't just Dorothy, the disowned mother. I was part of something greater, a quiet army of forgotten voices finally finding strength together. And while Chelsea and Brian still wrestled with their pride, still stumbled under the weight of consequences, I realized something powerful. I was no longer defined by their acceptance. I was defined by my own courage to speak, to stand, to live with dignity. That night, as I walked home under the cold stars, I felt lighter. The future was still uncertain, my heart still bruised. but I wasn't alone anymore. And in that truth, there was hope. Winter settled in, cold and quiet, but something inside me had shifted. The holidays no longer carried the same ache they once did. Yes, I still felt the sting of Chelsea's words, the way she had stood at that table and cut me from the family like trimming a loose thread. But I also carried the warmth of those who had chosen to stand beside me, my grandchildren sneaking into my room for comfort, neighbors showing up with casseroles and stories of their own, women at church who wiped away their tears as we shared our silent burdens out loud. For years, I had lived in fear of being alone. I thought my worth depended on whether my children wanted me, whether they valued my sacrifices. But slowly, I came to see that loneliness wasn't the absence of people. True loneliness was being unseen, unheard, even in a crowded room. And now, ironically, being cast aside had opened a door I never expected. I had found people who truly saw me. Chelsea, for all her bitterness, began to feel the cracks in her control. The community no longer looked at her with admiration, but with quiet disapproval. She hated it, though she'd never admit it. Brian, meanwhile, grew more withdrawn, as though his conscience was a weight he could no longer carry in silence. Every now and then, he would glance at me across the room, his lips pressing into a line of regret. Perhaps he was beginning to understand that silence, too, is a form of betrayal. And yet, I didn't wait for their apologies anymore. I didn't live each day wondering if they would come back, or if they'd ever see me as more than just the one who paid the bills. I had stopped holding my breath for their redemption. Because my life was worth more than their approval. I poured my time into the women's group, into helping others find strength in their stories. We laughed together, we wept together, and in those hours, I felt more alive than I had in years. I wasn't invisible anymore. My voice mattered. My pain had meaning. Christmas came and went, quieter than it used to be, but not empty. Emma drew me a picture of a family standing under a tree, and in her small, crooked handwriting, she wrote, "You will always be my grandma." That little note, taped to my fridge, meant more to me than any expensive gift ever could. By spring, Chelsea's bitterness had hardened into silence. She didn't visit, didn't call. Brian, however, finally knocked on my door one evening. His face was pale, his hands trembling. "Mom," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "I can't stop thinking about that night. About what we did." I listened, not speaking, letting him unravel in front of me. He wept as though years of guilt had finally broken loose. And in that moment, I realized forgiveness is not about forgetting or excusing. It's about freeing yourself from the prison of bitterness. I placed my hand gently over his. "You have to carry your choices, Brian. But you don't have to carry them alone." Did that mean everything was fixed? No. Family is not a broken plate that can simply be glued back together without the cracks showing. But maybe some bonds can be mended, if both sides are willing to bleed a little in the process. Looking back now, I see that Thanksgiving not as an ending, but as a beginning. Yes, it was the day my children cut me out. But it was also the day I found my strength, the day I stopped waiting for others to validate my worth. I discovered that sometimes the worst betrayals reveal the strongest truths. To those listening, maybe you've been there too. Maybe your children, or your spouse, or someone you loved deeply turned their back on you when you needed them most. Maybe you've been made to feel disposable, like your sacrifices were forgotten. I want you to hear me when I say this: you are not disposable. You are not invisible. Your story matters. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: even when the people you gave everything to turn away, there are others waiting to see you, to hear you, to remind you that your life still carries meaning. Sometimes you just have to be brave enough to open that envelope life hands you, no matter how painful, and see what truth is written inside. Now I want to turn this over to you. What would you do if you were in my situation? Have you ever experienced something like this, or known someone who has? Share your story in the comments. Your voice might be the one someone else needs to hear today. And tell me, which story should we explore next?